What does a poster display about women's history tell us about women in America? Not exactly what it intended, I suspect, and that's my subject on today's Fiamingo File. I'm Janice Fiamingo of the University of Ottawa. One of the biggest obstacles to rational conversation about men and women today is the conviction on the part of pretty well everyone that women as a whole were oppressed and men privileged throughout all of human history. Because few of us know history well, and because many recent histories have been written by feminists, we are unable to assess oft-repeated claims about how badly women were treated in the past. In this video, I will provide a brief outline of some highlights of American women's history over the last century and more, using as my springboard a poster display by the Fordham University School of Law, a highly ranked law school in New York City. Fordham Law School recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of the admission of women to the school. And although the purpose of the display seems to be to highlight the struggles women have had in a society that too often denied them equal opportunities, in fact, the display can't help but illustrate that many decisions on women's behalf were taken a long time ago by men to remedy injustices feminists say remain unaddressed today. Let's start with the event foregrounded by the display that the school opened its doors to women in September of 1918. Yes, just over 100 years ago, Fordham law administrators thought it appropriate for women to study to practice law in the same classrooms as their male colleagues, to compete with men and read the same textbooks. What the display doesn't mention is that Fordham was far from the first. Women were admitted to some American law schools as early as the 1870s and were allowed to practice law in federal courts starting in 1878. In related professional work, women had been practicing medicine, for example, for decades before this, with the first woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, graduating from a medical school in 1849 and the first woman's medical college opening in Philadelphia in 1850. Women had been studying at university long before that, ever since Bradford Academy in Massachusetts began admitting women in 1803. And by mid-century, a number of distinguished female academics were working as university professors. In 1866, Sarah Jane Woodson Early became the first African-American woman professor hired at Wilberforce University to teach Latin and English. Frances Willard, famed temperance leader and women's activist, became the first female college president at Evanston College for Ladies in 1871, the same year as Harriet Cook became the first full professor at Cornell University, a professor of German and history, earning the same salary as her male colleagues. There are many other such long-ago milestones of equality that could be named. And it's worth noting that many of these academic and professional opportunities were opened prior to or in tandem with the first wave feminist movement. In other words, male willingness to help women, in some cases, predated the organized women's movement and certainly predated women's winning of the right to vote. This simply does not sound like a society that confined women to the home, that doubted women's intellectual competence, or that denied them the opportunity to use their gifts. Quite the opposite. If men had wanted to deny women such opportunities in the 19th century, they could easily have done so, but did not. In 2016, the number of female students studying law outnumbered the number of male students, just as the number of women at universities all across North America significantly outpaces that of male students. Though there have always been men willing to listen to and attempt to address female complaints, very few women today express concern about men's massive academic decline. In general, the Fordham School of Law display tells the history of women at the school and in society generally as if it is incontestably the history of struggle against forces that have kept women down. The display says that Fordham women's, quote, achievements, along with those of women from U.S. and world history, form a timeline of strength and fortitude, end quote. Fortitude, the virtue of enduring difficulties with courage, certainly was demonstrated by some women in the U.S. and the world, but the Fordham display also demonstrates other, less desirable qualities such as hypersensitivity, unfounded resentment, and narcissistic entitlement. For example, we are told that in 1955, the Fordham University School of Law marked its 50th anniversary, quote, with no formal acknowledgement of its woman students, end quote. An absurd statement. Why should it have acknowledged its woman students in any particular manner? If women really do want equality of opportunity and equal treatment with men, then a special acknowledgement should be the very last thing anyone would desire, especially given the commonness of women in academia by the mid-1950s, when women accounted for about 1/3 of all university students. The fact that an indignant feminist, I'm assuming, thought this allegation appropriate for a public display in 2018 and that others approved it says much about the grievance-mongering compulsion amongst feminist commentators today. Far too many women in our society feel a vested interest, it seems, in promoting a victimhood narrative, even when that narrative is directly contradicted by available facts, a point illustrated in other parts of the Fordham Law School display. One startling piece of evidence comes when we are told that in 1963, well over half a century ago, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act, quote, making it illegal for employers to pay a woman less than what a man would receive for the same job, end quote. Come again? But aren't women paid 75 cents to every male dollar? No. Of course not. Paying a woman less for doing the same job as a man became illegal in 1963, the year before I was born. Here is a bit of history rarely mentioned by feminists who continually complain about the wage gap, a zombie fact debunked time and time again, but apparently unkillable. As many reputable commentators have explained, and the links are below, women as a group do make less overall than men, but that's because they tend to choose different types of work to do, tend to work fewer hours, take less overtime than men do, and make other choices that lead to lower income. The situation has nothing to do with sex discrimination. Though many loyal feminists continue to believe that a woman standing next to a man performing exactly the same job is being paid less for her work simply because she's female, it isn't so. And governments have gone even further to assuage feminist anger. In later decades, quote, equal pay for work of equal value became the new Orwellian rallying cry. It became fashionable and was in some cases built into legislation that men and women doing different jobs should be paid the same for them if the jobs were deemed similar enough, according to estimates of the skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions associated with them, though quite independent of their market value. Is a librarian worth the same as an archivist? Yes, say feminists, because librarians tend to be women and archivists more often men. No, say, employers who discover that it's far easier to hire a competent librarian than a skilled archivist. And through it all, we continue to hear about the mythical wage gap. As the Fordham Law poster inadvertently shows us, feminists have so seriously hoodwinked huge segments of the public that few of us know the facts about male legislators' willingness to accede to women's demands. On the front of employment, the Fordham display shows us other major gains for feminism that we don't often hear about today. In 1968, we learn, still more than half a century ago, President Lyndon Johnson prohibited sex discrimination by government contractors and required affirmative action plans for hiring women. This is quite staggering to contemplate. Government-mandated affirmative action hiring, the targeted hiring of women because they are women, has been in place for close to 50 years. Feminists are quiet about this fact. I remember being told when I first learned about affirmative action hiring in the late 1980s that it was a temporary measure to help women and certain minority groups overcome historical barriers and to enable them to see people like themselves in public positions so that they would feel comfortable striving for such positions. But could any reasonable person say that we now live in a society where women can't see women in positions of authority and influence? Yet affirmative action hiring has become, it seems, a permanent feature of many workplaces involving the deliberate sidelining of qualified white men for about 2 generations and the shoehorning of mainly women into positions by virtue of the fact that they were born female. Do women never get tired of having things handed to them? Not most of them, not so far. Today, feminists are bolder than ever about demanding gender quotas or radical measures for fields and positions in which women remain a minority. They don't in general care about fields and positions in which men are a minority. And as if in evidence that there hasn't been a need for affirmative action hiring, if there ever was, for a long time, but that this hasn't stopped women from playing the victim card, we learn from the Fordham display that in 1984, that's 35 years ago, a graduate of Fordham Law School, Geraldine Ferraro, was the first female vice presidential candidate with presidential candidate Walter Mondale to attempt to unseat incumbent Ronald Reagan and his running mate George Bush Sr. During the campaign, Ferraro, reading straight out of the feminist playbook, accused her vice presidential opponent, George Bush, of taking a, quote, patronizing tone with her in their debate. Bush routinely used the rhetorical device of, let me help you to understand, with all opponents, but the story became that he was being condescending with a woman. It's clear that being a woman in politics has, since at least 1984, brought with it the right to accuse one's political opponents of sexism, a cheap shot for which the opponent has little recourse. 1984 was also the year that a landmark Supreme Court case opened up male-only private clubs to women. Men have not been able to gather in private clubs for over 35 years. Female-only private clubs and spaces are, of course, fine. These stories of female firsts and feminist legal victories give us a flavor of the Fordham Law School display. It's all about women showing they're just as good as men, fighting for equal rights. At least that's the story we're supposed to take from it. A more objective appraisal should lead to the conclusion that it's been A very long time since anyone could legitimately say that women have been legally disadvantaged in American society, and that in actuality the historical record has been one of male-authored decisions and legal initiatives to advantage women and to aid their success, often at male expense. On the fronts of pay equity, affirmative action hiring, and political advantage, women have been given special privileges for many decades. It's a result of the genius of feminism and the gynocentric gullibility of the rest of us that feminists can continue to insist on how long-suffering women are. Please consider supporting us on Subscribestar to help us keep producing male-positive, anti-feminist, and anti-SJW content.